Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to today's episode. I have a special episode planned for you today. I have a special episode planned for you every time. But before we get into that, of course, you know I like to do the administrative stuff first. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or even suggestions for another episode, adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. And if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to this podcast. If you're on iTunes, be sure to follow so that way that you know when new episodes drop. Be sure to leave a positive review and share the podcast because I do believe that sharing is caring. So if you know of someone that could benefit from listening to this, please do share this episode. And I do have individual and group membership coaching opening up at the end of the month. So if you'd like to be the first in the know to know when that drops and you want to be on that list for coaching services for, narcissistic abuse and other relationship wounding, if you are ready to get your life back on track and get back on the fast track to healing, you definitely want to be a part of the individual and or group membership coaching. So please go to the show notes and subscribe to be a part of that mailing list so that you know when it drops. And if you're in California, and you're looking for individual and group counseling, I do have a narcissistic abuse support group as well as in individual counseling. Go to drnataliejones.com and check me out there. Also, you can sign up for my newsletter to be informed about, random writings I have and healing tips that I have about narcissistic abuse. I send that out on a weekly basis. Currently on my website, you can download a free ebook to determine how to know if you are toxic. So I would suggest that you go there if you're interested in hearing more about that. Love to have you and love to connect with you. Today's guest is a very special guest. Nicol Stolar-Peterson, licensed clinical social worker. And one of the reasons that Nicole is very special to me is because Nicole and I share a lot of commonalities in terms of fighting the good fight for human service work. And Nicole is an advocate against child abuse, as am I an advocate against child abuse. Nicole got her start in her career being a child protective services social worker. And this episode is also very, very special to me with Nicole because when this podcast started 4 years ago, I had such a tough time. It's a tough time when you're a new podcaster and you're looking for a guest to be on your show. People are like, what? I don't know you. I don't know what your podcast is about. I don't know. And it's sketchy. Nicole was the first person to support me, and she was my very first guest on my podcast. So as such, she's always going to be a friend to the show. And I love having her on here because she knows her stuff. And I will forever be grateful to her for being the very first guest that I had on my show 4 years ago. I can't believe I've been podcasting that long, but truly indeed, it's been quite a journey on podcasting. Anyhow, last week's episode, I talked a lot about how to help children of narcissistic parents, how to extend help from a community perspective and an individual perspective. This week, Nicole and I take a deeper dive in terms of what do we do when things escalate? How do we get authorities involved? When should we do that? What should we know before doing that? And so she, educates us. And I feel like this is an episode, one of these episodes that we could probably talk about all day long and still not get all the bases covered because there's just so many nuances. And again, every situation is different. Some cases are a lot more complex than others. But again, Nicole does a lot of work as an expert witness for court, which is something that I'm also starting to break into now, which is another reason why I love talking to Nicole because she knows her stuff. But there's so much stuff that kind of goes into this, but she breaks it down and we talk about it in the shortest and most concise way possible. And without further ado, here's my interview with Nicole. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm fantastic. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy for you to be here too. So, for people who don't know who you are, my listeners, can you talk a little bit about who you are and what you do and what drives the passion behind your work?
Sure. So my name is Nicole Stolar-Peterson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I actually used to work for Child Protective Services for almost 12 years and did investigations, forensic interviews, foster care, adoptions, all sorts of stuff. And when I left the agency, I went into private practice and got into some family law, doing child custody evaluations. And I started to shift towards taking on expert witness cases that have to do with what happens when children are taken into custody or things that come up in foster care. So I actually will take cases for both the plaintiff and for the defense, because the truth is the truth. So it doesn't really matter who hires me. But I also started a business called Therapist Court Prep to help therapists deal with court, because court oftentimes is a really scary thing, especially for therapists, because it's really not part of our training. It's really not something that's covered. And in addition to that, being able to help therapists get ready for court, one of the other things that comes up quite a bit is mandated reporting. So as mandated reporters, we are expected to pick up the phone and make a phone call when we suspect child abuse. And that can really be a struggle for some of our colleagues because there's a lot of fear behind what happens after, that phone call happens. And so I do dabble around a little bit in different areas, but for the most part, it really comes back to kids, court, kids, court, child abuse, and then just helping out our colleagues so that they are not feeling like they're alone when, that subpoena shows up or something like that. Yeah.
Awesome. And can you tell us a little bit about what made you so passionate about kids in court?
Sure. Having worked at Child Protective Services, but even before then, I used to work at a group home. Before then, another place with kids who just had really gone through things that are kind of unimaginable, things that we maybe see in the news that are just really shocking. And I love working with kids. I love how kids share their experiences, sometimes with, a kid filter or no filter at all. And actually, I started a nonprofit that was based off of one very significant experience that I had in court with a child who was in foster care, and just seeing how scared they were before going into the courtroom, and recognizing that it didn't really matter what I said at that point because they were already scared to be able to go into that room and to have an experience where they could maybe take back a little bit of the power. And I realized it was a need. And so I actually found a program called Kids Court. And so then we founded our own Kids Court and Counseling Center. And so it's here in Riverside County, and we run it for free. We're blessed to have some grants with the District Attorney's Office and our local SAFE and Family Justice Center. And we actually have kids who are in therapy for free, who are receiving amazing care. And we also help children prepare for court. We do trauma reduction and exposure and get them ready for an environment that is, can be really unsettling, because we want them to leave feeling stronger. We want them to leave feeling better than when they came in versus, more traumatized. And so kids have always been very important to me. And I've just been able to shift, I think, through my career as to how I want to help kids and how we can show up for them, because children really get discounted. As much as we as a society, we love children and we talk about how important they are, for some reason, when they disclose something that has happened, we discount them. When they're witnesses in court, we also discount them. And so I think it's important to listen to children. I think they have a lot of important information for us, especially when big things have happened. And so I'm very passionate about kids. I believe children deserve safety, and they deserve to be listened to. So I'm just really grateful anytime I get a chance to talk with somebody who lets me talk, because I talk a lot about kids. I'm so grateful because they're amazing. And thank you for anybody who's listening who works with children. Just thank you for listening to them and being there for them, because kids deserve to have people show up for them.
I agree. And I appreciate you for saying that. And I'm very sorry for my landscaper outside that's deciding to, get really loud all of a sudden. Um, I want to talk a little bit about that, because this is a special interview. It's our 3-year anniversary, you and I, of being,
So
you were my
cool.
very first guest on my show.
That's
So it's
awesome.
exactly 3 years to the day that we recorded this show, back in August of 2017. Is that so? That's a little bit more than 3 years. But so I wanted to kind of dig into that, child abuse, reporting child abuse. What are the systems that are in place? Because I think it gets very complicated for a lot of people. And I know that you talk a lot about mandated reporters, but I'm also wondering about people that aren't mandated, people that maybe are just family members,
Mhm.
people that just see and hear, maybe even not just family members, but are neighbors or, community members, maybe churchgoers or something like that. People that notice things that are off or that are questionable, and, how people can feel comfortable enough to take action in advocacy, because a lot of people, I think, and this is like a long-winded thing, but I think a lot of people don't want to get involved.
Yeah. And it's also that, that phenomenon of, somebody else will call, right? Somebody else will do it. And time again, especially when you see some of those bigger cases that hit the news, and you realize how many people will comment, I knew something was wrong, or I saw something and I didn't say something, I didn't do anything. And so let's definitely talk about the people who are not mandated reporters. You are the neighbor or the family member or somebody around that has a worry. And so when you call in a child abuse report, you're not saying child abuse has happened. You're saying I'm worried or I suspect it. That's what you're basically saying, is that, I want to make sure this kid's okay. And so here's what can happen. There's different outcomes for when you make that phone call. It's they could look at the information and think, okay, there's not enough, and they could maybe evaluate it out. Or they could say, you know what, this doesn't really seem like something we would cover, but maybe it's something law enforcement would cover, or maybe there's a resource that we can, send out. Okay, so then there's, oh, this is an emergency. We need to go out right now. We have to get out there. Then there's some, and every state and county has, different timeframes, but typically you might see like a 3-day, 5-day, or 10-day response, dependent upon, they have like a decision tree of, what's the potential for danger for this kiddo, and so, or kids. And so you are going to make a decision based on that. So you might have an immediate response, you might have a 10-day response, you might have no response. But what at least happens for kids, even if, let's say when we see smoke, we can't find the fire, but we keep seeing the smoke. Okay, so maybe this happens 3 times or 5 times. But guess what? Maybe that 6th time comes in, and now that child is, somewhere else, and somebody's saying something. And now when we look at the records, we see this pattern, right? We see smoke, 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 smoke. And then, oh my gosh, this thing's happening. So I always say to people, don't feel bad if you're calling in something and you don't see anything like come of it, because that could actually be the starting point for the paper trail that has to happen or needs to happen to show that this is an ongoing issue. So sometimes, even when you don't see a response, if somebody like me gets a hold of it and I get to see the pattern, I'm like, oh, wait a second, this has been going on for a while. We had something pop over here, something pop over there, and maybe now's the time we can get in and do something. So I always, I know people struggle because when you're not a mandated reporter, you don't have to get a phone call back as to, what the outcome was. but that doesn't mean that something didn't happen. It doesn't mean that it's not helpful to have that phone call on record, because it might help that kiddo later. Because sometimes, like I said before, people don't believe kids. So maybe that sixth time that kid says something, it's like, oh, we got to get in there and do something. And it really did help, that phone call that you made, that you were like, oh, I didn't see the outcome. They didn't do anything. Nothing happened. But it actually might be something, and it could be helpful later. So I always just go on the side of caution. Every state has a phone number. Some counties, even you can go online and do it. But most states, you have a hotline phone number. Every state in the United States has a reporting hotline. They have to. It's federal law. Like, we all have to offer this child protection. And when you call, typically they're going to ask you to follow up with something in writing. But the phone call is that first, kickoff to get things going. And then that person who's taking in the information, as most states now have, they have access to a state system where they can see if there's history. They can see that, this has happened 5 times before, or that something maybe pops up in another county or area. So that's really helpful. So each state now is running their own, I would say platform, if you will, to share information in some capacity or record it, so that we don't have people who, they do something in one county and then they go to another and they're like, nobody will ever find out. And it's like, well, wait a minute, and we can connect them. And so that's the great thing about, some of our technology now, is it's easier to have that access. So again, it's what I say to everyone is, if you have this worry, what would it feel like if you didn't pick up the phone and then you saw it on the news at night? And that's happened to many people, who were like, oh my gosh. And then the news came on, and I just had known it was happening. And I didn't, think it was my place, right? I hear that. I didn't think it was my place to call, or I didn't want to start any problems. And Child Protective Services, or Department of Children and Families, or whatever it's called, wherever it's called something different in every state and county.
Mm-hmm.
Their job is not to give up your information. And so if you have a concern about your, information being shared, you can voice that to the screener. And the only person who typically can, let's say your mandated reporter, give that information up, as a judge would have to actually order the release. And I haven't really known that to happen unless you're talking about like a big, maybe like a murder case or something like that, and they really want to talk to the witness. So yeah.
I have known cases where people have had their identity revealed, but again, you're right. It's usually once it goes to court and it becomes this big legal thing.
Yeah.
I guess, for people that are listening, what constitutes child abuse?
Well, there's a lot of different things, and there's some different, it's written a little bit differently in each state. So I want to kind of be careful with that. And I encourage everybody to look it up in your state, what it actually means. But essentially, it's injuring a child in different ways, right? So causing injury to a child by not feeding them, right? So a form of neglect. Causing injury to a child by failing to take them to their medical appointments. So we have medical neglect. Causing injury to a child, failing to protect, knowing or reasonably should have known that somebody was perpetrating, sexual abuse on your child and not protecting them from it. Being the perpetrator of sexual abuse on a child, whether it's your child or somebody else's. Physical abuse, again, causing some type of injury to a child. And some places an injury can be, a handprint. Other, it might be more extreme, but we have children who have significant injuries, that are just babies, and healing fractures because they've been enduring more than one episode of abuse, which is quite common. And children who are, going to be more at risk, of course, are the potty training age. So children under 5 are our most high risk group. But it's the idea of what causes an injury. And when we talk about an injury, you have to think about, is it an injury to their ability to move freely? Is it a kid who's chained up? Is it a kid who gets whooped with a belt buckle, and they were running away from it, and of course they're running away from it. Who wouldn't run from a belt? But sometimes we'll see belt buckle marks on like an arm or a face, and it already tells me like they were trying to get away, and the person who was doing the AKA whooping was out of control. Because if you look at like kind of old school, kind of almost methodical weapons, they would loop it, hold it in their hand, and the buckle would be inside of the palm. And when somebody's out of control and they're whipping it over their heads, almost like it's the Wild West, that is out of control. I don't care what happens other than I want you to hurt because I'm angry. I'm triggered as the adult, right? I'm out of control. I don't have control. I'm mad and I want to inflict some type of pain or punishment on you. And that's the thing about when people are like, well, wait, can't I discipline my kids? Well, hold on. What does discipline mean? Discipline is to teach, right? It's to lead and to teach. We're trying to change behaviors. When we inflict pain, we have done a very quick, kind of jolt to the system to stop the behavior for a moment. That kid's just going to get more sneaky and figure out how to do it and not get caught. It's not actually changing how they think about their choices or what they did. It's like, I don't want to feel that pain again. How do I get around that? Versus somebody who's going to talk to their kid and find out like what was happening inside of them. And what most of us as adults know is physical, sexual, because all those different kinds of abuse typically come from an adult who is feeling like they don't have control. And that's how injuries start happening. Because think of this, if you're going to, spank a child with your hand, you can feel your hand, you know how hard you've hit. Once you introduce an object, you have no idea the force that you are striking with, and the odds of leaving an injury are much higher from a ruler, a belt, a shoe, whatever object you pick. So child abuse in and of itself, many of us were spanked as kids, and people say, oh, I guess I was abused. Well, there was quite a difference, right? When our parents said, okay, you were in trouble and here's why, and here's what's happening, and this is what's going to happen. That's quite different from somebody who inflicts, whether it's intentional or not, an injury. A lot of times people, I didn't mean to, leave a mark. Well, but you had to reasonably have known when you picked up that, tree branch, or you picked up that belt or whatever, that the chances were higher, right? Or you were so angry or you were so out of control, you didn't even think about that, right? So that's not about discipline, that's about punishment, that's about inflicting pain. So when we really look at child abuse and we look at neglect, it's really just that failure for that adult, right, to be in some type of control, to stay calm and to discipline if that's what even needed to happen. But there's people who will abuse children. It has nothing to do with discipline or punishment. It just has to do with an anger or a hatred or a jealousy, which is strange to say out loud, but it's very true, towards a child, and kids get hurt. So I encourage everyone to take a look at what their local statute is. Just Google child abuse hotline and boop, something will pop up and it'll actually tell you exactly in your state, but it's fairly close to that. It's just, there's a few nuances.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. And I know we're talking about adults versus children, but I also wonder about children versus children, and when that also becomes child abuse. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. And again, each state is very different,
Yeah.
dependent upon the age difference, right? So when we look at kids and how far apart they are in age, when you're talking about a 17-year-old, raping a 6-year-old, that's a very big jump. And that's not somebody who is in their social setting, right? Maybe it's in their home setting or they got access to that child, but 17-year-olds are typically should be hanging out with 16, 17, 18-year-olds, right? It's kind of their group. So it kind of says, okay, well, why are they choosing, right, to be over with this child? And so we kind of have to ask those questions. And so when we talk about child abuse to child abuse, one, we have to know not only what's the separation in age, what's the competency of each child, right? And little ones cannot consent to any of it, right? They just can't. They just don't have the brain isn't grown yet. People might argue, well, the teenagers' brains aren't grown yet. But when bigger kids typically inflict pain on others, and sometimes it's same age kids, we have to figure out what the motivation is. Is it that I'm being hurt, so I want you to hurt? Or is it, this is the only way I know how to act because this is what I've learned in my house? But it really depends. So every single case of when there's a child to child, which it's not going to be called child abuse in any state, but it feels like it should be, but it's something different. It's basically, child violence towards other kids. We have to ask ourselves competency, age, what's going on in the home environment, how long have they demonstrated some of these behaviors? When we start digging in, we realize there's some other stuff going on. It's been going on for a while. Parents are thinking, oh, they just have a lot of energy, or, oh, my kid's not, we need to take another look. And kids who demonstrate a lack of remorse should definitely have us be concerned. And again, when we have kids who don't show remorse or don't show respect for other people's personal space, right? That's something we have to address. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to go and inflict some type of harm on somebody else, but we have to address it, because we want, as they go to become adults, what are they going to do if they don't know how to keep their hands to themselves, right? We have all these adults running around that don't keep their hands to themselves, and they go to jail, or they should go to jail. And so again, coming back to kids, it's what's happening at home. That's always my first question. What environment are they in? But I'm always curious when I talk to a kiddo, is it fear? Is it shame? Is it, where is it coming from? And that helps me have a better sense of, what it's really about. But I think sometimes adults are too trusting, leaving much older kids with younger kids, and not really thinking it through. Yeah.
I would agree. There can be a lot of room for error there. And then also too, some of the things that I've seen just with folks is discounting sibling abuse. Like if there's sexual abuse or even
Right.
physical abuse and bullying between
Right.
siblings, even if they're in the same age bracket, a lot of times they'll kind of want to overlook or, just not really address it in that way.
Let's talk about why don't people want to address it, right? So what does it say about you as a parent? And then it's like, well, I just want to ignore that because it's kind of this dark, ugly area I don't feel comfortable in. And that's where kids get hurt. It's when we just want to leave it alone. And so the thing that I share with parents and mandate everybody across the board is this: when we talk to our own kids and we teach others how to talk to their kids, the message should be clear. It should be, no matter what happens, right? You can always come to me. We don't keep secrets, okay? Because there's a difference between a secret and a surprise, right? We don't keep secrets. And I have your back no matter what. So here's what you need to know about me as your parent, and or we're teaching is that it doesn't matter who it is. If you see me shake their hands or if they're in our family, you matter most to me, no matter what. Your safety, nobody gets to make you feel uncomfortable. And I use the words uncomfortable or icky or ask you to keep a secret, because those are typically the words, right, to describe what sometimes kids go through. And instead of saying, don't let anybody ever touch you down there, don't let anybody hurt you down there. That's not it, because a lot of sexual abuse does not hurt. And kids get very confused by that. And then they feel ashamed because it didn't hurt. And they're like, well, then that must not be what it was. There's something wrong with me. I've done something really wrong. Oh, I'm going to be in trouble. So then they don't talk. So instead it's, okay, yucky, icky, secrets, but no matter what, I've got your back, kiddo. Like, you're mine. And it doesn't matter, again, if they're in our family, if they're a coach, a teacher, whoever. And it's a weird conversation to have with kids because we want them to feel some trust towards the adults and the others around them. But at the same time, we want them to know it doesn't matter who they are. If it's my sister, brother, grandparent, coach, you matter most. You can always come to me. And then when you tell me the truth, I will not get upset with you. And that's the promise that we have to make, as hard as sometimes those truths might be to hear. No matter what, I've got your back. And then we're going to have less secrets and less of that. But again, when we're letting, siblings hurt siblings, and we're like, oh, they're just being kids. I went through it as a kid. Is it really the same? And how did it make you feel? And how does that contribute to you as an adult and in those other spaces? Yes. What do you want for your kids? What kind of relationships do you want them to have with each other? And what do you want that to look like? But again, in the house is where we learn how we're going to be out in the world. So we have to work on the stuff in the house before our kids get bigger and bigger and go out into the world. And people don't care at all once a kid is 17 or 19 or 25, when they have some horrible crime. They don't care how rough their childhood was. They really don't give a crap. They don't want to hear about it. All they see is that big thing that happened. And what happens is then all that other stuff goes away. So there's not going to be anybody feeling sorry for any of us that we had a rough childhood, because once we become an adult, it is what it is, right? Big things have happened and people really get like, oh, that's it. I don't care about their childhood. They killed somebody or they did this or they did that. So I always feel like we only have so much time with our kids to get them ready for the world, because once they get out there, it's everything else kind of goes away. And whatever we've given them, those roots, those things to stand on, they have to go with them into the world, because people really don't want to hear about, how tough they had it. They just see what they see. And we're in especially now more than ever as a society, we're in kind of a clip, we see a clip and a snapshot. That's what we see. And we make judgments based upon snapshots instead of sometimes the whole picture. And as we prepare our children, we have to get them ready. So hopefully they're never in that snapshot, they're never in that setting. Yeah, it's really risky.
It is a risk. From a lot of the stuff that you've mentioned in terms of constituting child abuse, one of the things that I've noticed is it's based off of things, physical things that we can see, or physical actions.
Yeah.
As this podcast and my specialty is narcissistic abuse. And a lot of times with narcissistic abuse, you can't see it. It's there's a form of psychological violence or maltreatment or whatever word you want to use for it.
Right.
I'm wondering, in your experience, if at all, where does that come into play when we're talking about child abuse?
It'll show up typically in emotional abuse, and emotional abuse is really hard to stick. Like you said, you can't see it. And it's hard to stick in court, because you not only need the events that would have caused it, but then you have to show how, right? How can you prove that this is actually what's happening?
Quantify.
So,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in a very concrete way that oftentimes is difficult. So if a child says, I saw my dad, choking my mom, which is, I usually hear kids say choking, and a lot of adults too, which actually choking is the inside of the throat, not the outside. So it would be strangulation. But people think strangulation equals death, but it really just means, the compression on the outside of the throat. So a kid will say, I saw my dad choking my mom, and she passed out, and I went to check on her to make sure she was breathing. And now at night, every night I go to check on her. So now we can correlate these actions with this child's fear and anxiety, that every night he checks on his mom to make sure she's breathing, or he's a fear that she's going to be dead every night. So now I can show, okay, I don't just have, domestic violence. I also have this child who experienced it, and it is emotional abuse because of the following. So emotional abuse is much harder, because again, you oftentimes can't see it. But the thing about emotional abuse, and I want to use an amazing quote that I got from Leslie Baker, who's an amazing therapist here in California. And we were talking at a conference about kids, and she said, kids are showers, not tellers. And it gives me the chills just saying it out loud. And I've probably said it in depositions and reports about kids, because they show right before they tell often. And so there's a behavior, or there's a demonstration of the fear, the anxiety, the pain. And so for kids with emotional abuse, when we see it, might be the fetal position. They might, start wetting themselves. We start to see them kind of going backwards, if you will. They were potty trained, and now all of a sudden they're not. They are struggling with, they're starting to like almost throw tantrums as if they're going back to being a toddler. So we see things oftentimes before we know what they are. And so with kids, especially in homes where there's violence, we see kids who oftentimes, they don't have as many words as other kids, because they don't talk as much. They've kind of learned that's not what you do here. You have kids who are they have a really high, startle response. They are worried about words and what they really mean. They tend to not believe anybody ever. Especially if they live with a narcissist who says one thing but does another. And so you have to start paying attention to those things. And when we're talking to those kids, it's, tell me everything about what your mom says about this. Tell me everything about what your dad says, because we want to get context of that. Oh, well, he says we're going to go to Disneyland, but we never actually go. Oh, okay. Well, what do you normally do? And so you can find out a lot about what they believe to be true or not true, how they feel about themselves, how they've been made to feel about themselves, and then kind of how they see the world. And that's how we get back to that point of, is this emotional abuse? What's been happening? Has it gotten to the point where it affects them physically. And most often in kids, you usually do. You see kids who will throw up, kids who have, accidents, if you want to call it that, or kids who are now starting to get in fights at school. They're doing these other things. And then everybody points at the kid. Oh, that's the kid that fights. And it's like, wait, let's look over here at the house. What's happening? What's happening that all of a sudden you have a kid showing, right? I'm showing my aggression. I'm showing that I'm upset. I don't know how to cope with stress. So I'm going to fight because that's what I've learned, right? Or I feel so threatened that that's the only thing I can think to do right now. Because when kids survive emotional abuse and they survive these homes, it's like this constant fear of death. They're just, what's coming next? When's the other shoe going to drop? And they just function at a much more stressed out, anxious state than the average kids. But on the outside, they look just like they're walking around like a regular kid, but then somebody bumps into them and all of a sudden they're getting knocked out. And you're like, wait, what happened? He didn't even mean to bump into you, but you just have a lot more reactions. It's just a lot faster.
Yeah.
It's a lot faster to flip your lid, if you will. So yeah, emotional abuse is very big, a little harder though, a little harder to prove.
It is, and I hear that a lot. And when I say that, when we say that we can't see, narcissistic abuse, what I mean is that, a lot of times these systems feel like they can't quantify narcissistic abuse. And, I heard you talk about some of the kids that kind of act out aggressively or they regress in their childhood state, meaning that they're now doing maybe toddlerish behaviors or, those kind of things. But I'm also wondering about the child that is not allowed to have friends at school, the child that's not allowed to have other basic emotional needs met. The child that, is basically degraded consistently at home, the child that on the outside may not necessarily exude a problem or may actually even look like the perfect child because there's no problems. They're very quiet. They're very well maintained and they look really good.
Yeah.
And these are childs that don't necessarily scream that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
The ball is dropped, I think.
Oh, the ball's not even in the
Yeah.
vicinity because you can't see it. And it's very hard to treat something you can't see. And when you have a kid like that, and you're like, it always seemed kind of weird. They weren't allowed to really go do certain things and this, that, and the other. Those are the kids that are going to be so much harder to get a disclosure from about what's happening because there's so much fear involved with that. When you have that amount of control, the amount of fear is it's so much harder for us on the outside to even comprehend it because if we haven't grown up with it, we just don't get it. Well, it's not like he was standing there holding a gun to your head. You were at school, like you could have told somebody. And it's like, no, when you've been trained, that this is how things are and the fear of what could happen. And this could be a parent that's never even had to lay a finger on you, right?
Yes.
They just have the power and control with their words and with other actions and with the isolating behaviors, all those different things.
Yes.
Those kids, it's almost, to be devil's advocate, like how would we know and then could we talk to them just, hey, how are things going? Everything's fine. Okay. And again, without evidence, right, that something's happening or that they are being harmed in some way, it's very, very difficult. And typically those are the kids I worry about more. It's always the quiet kids, right? Because you worry that they are just going to one day explode and they're just quiet. They take it. And then there's one day. I almost find it easier to work with the kids who are, every day having an issue or saying something or doing something, like, at least I can see it, right? It makes it easier to see. It's kind of like when you have a rash, you're like, I can see it. I know I need to go take some Benadryl, right? But for kids, when we don't see it, yes, the kids who are waving the flags, and getting into trouble and whatever, we're going to go to them first because they are, exhibiting something, whereas the other kids are not. And unless something happens or somebody can get us to the point where we have a rapport that child's actually going to say, hey, actually, I'm locked in my room every night, or this, we don't have anything to go on as far as, being able to help them. So it is much, much harder, almost impossible. And that's the person who's also not going to let CPS come in the door to do an interview. And from just the descriptions we've given, it's probably not going to be enough for a probable cause statement to get a warrant even enter to go in and talk to the kid. And so every state too has different rules about interviewing children. Typically at school is fine. There's sometimes, time limitations, how much time you can be in the room with them. Others are, if it's not an emergency, then you should let the parent know that you're going to talk to them. Other times not. And obviously when we tell parents, that CPS is coming to talk to their kids, things change. Even if they haven't done anything wrong, they are more likely to coach that kid because they're scared. And as a CPS worker, I absolutely, from the bottom of my heart, from so many years, it just was horrible for me when parents were given the heads up that we had come to the school or that we were coming out, because even if they hadn't done anything wrong, they would, have some type of conversation with that child. The child would be more anxious meeting with me, less likely to disclose. And even in one case, they actually cleaned up the house before I got there, and the evidence as to how the burns had occurred. And I just remember the look on that kid's face, and he just said, please, please leave, please, like from the bottom of his heart. And I felt so sick to my stomach because I felt like my hands were tied, and they were, they really, really were. And so some things are really hard because if we can't get to it and we can't see it, it's really hard to say there's evidence. We can't just say we know, right? Lots of people know things, but can we prove it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the legal hole, I guess I should say, is that there's things that we can't prove. But I would also argue, that when we're taking a snapshot, we want, the legal system wants something they want that they can come out and prove right then and there on the spot, right? I can look at you and I can see it.
Right.
As opposed to saying, let's look at this over time and see what we can see.
Right.
Because although we can't, with psychological abuse or narcissistic abuse, you can't see it in the moment, but over time, you could probably see. The other thing that I wonder about is the coaching aspect, which, you and I've talked about before. And I'm sure that you could probably recognize now when someone is being coached, when a child is being coached.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about why parents coach their children?
Sure. Oftentimes it's out of fear. I haven't found a time that it hasn't been based in fear. Fear of having their child removed, fear of, losing custody in the family law case, fear of what they think the other parent is or isn't. And the thing about when it comes up during child custody, which is sometimes where we see it, not always, but sometimes, people who are going through a divorce, they actually spike higher on the MMPI in different areas, right? They aren't who they typically are. And anybody who's been through any type of a separation or divorce would say like, yeah, I don't know if I was in my right mind that whole time, or I was exhausted, or I was so depressed and it was such a different time for me. So parents aren't necessarily in their best emotional space, if that's fair. And so when they fear, a new girlfriend coming into the picture, well, what does that mean? Or they had some concerns maybe about their partner in certain ways. And now, that child is going every other weekend to that house, and fears come up. And so then they're thinking, well, maybe it'd just be better if they were here all the time with me. How about they just don't have to go? Or the kid says, I don't like death house. Why not? Oh, I don't know. I just don't. Oh, something bad must be happening. It's like, well, wait a minute, right? They have a loyalty conflict. And so oftentimes out of fear, a parent might, coach their kid to say something has happened that hasn't happened. And oftentimes, those kids have been given a small morsel of information that they're supposed to come in and tell a therapist or a teacher or somebody through court, hoping to move the needle towards custody. And the detriment to that child is so significant, and they will carry it with them for years and years into adulthood, that they said something that wasn't true about the other parent. And I just caution parents to really step back and make the choice not to coach your kid, make the choice to encourage your child no matter what, to always tell the truth. And don't worry about my feelings. Don't worry about mom's feelings, dad's feelings. Just don't worry about that. Just tell the truth. That's who I want you to be. And that way, when they go into a setting they don't have that extra pressure,
Yeah.
because it puts so much on the kid. And I really do struggle with it. Fortunately, more often than not, it's not coaching. It's really children do start to disclose things that have happened to them after there's two houses. So under one house, it was harder to say this is what's happening. But then when they get to take a breath, if you will, and they now live in two houses, maybe, mom's over here, dad's over here, or mom and mom, or whatever, they can take a breath and say, actually, I don't want to go over here, and here's why. And then unfortunately, what happens is then there's an assumption that, oh, well, this is child custody. They're coaching, they're lying. It's like, no, this kid finally just feels like they can take a breath and they can say, hey, this is why I don't like this, or this is what's happening. And, that's the same thing happens with foster care. Children come into foster care, and then, the second they know they're adopted, all of a sudden, boom, the floodgates open. It's like, let me tell you all these other things that happened to me. And you're like, wait, what? Because they finally feel safe, or they feel like they've got, just this sense of security, and then they can, come forward with their information. But I wanted to go back to what you said about the for law enforcement, even for CPS to be able to take the time to sit and watch. And what the mandates are, so most child protective agencies have 30 days to either open a case or not. That's all they're given, right? And then for law enforcement, they have a lot of pressure as well as far as closing and opening. But the issue that comes up is if somebody feels like they're being wrongly investigated over a period of time, they can sue. And so if you don't have enough evidence and you're getting sued for harassment now because you're trying to figure out if something's happening in the house, that's the risk that law enforcement and even CPS takes by, if they don't have enough evidence, at least by the legal system that we've all agreed to follow, if you will, right? So it's it's a mixed bag. You can't really win. And that's why I say sometimes you just have to catch it at the right time. So it sucks that you might have those 5 referrals or investigations and nothing came of them. But then number 6, it's like, oh, the kid's saying something, or, oh, we've got the physical evidence. And now we can go back and look at all these other things and connect them together, because sometimes we just don't have it the first time, but we do have to get out of it because the way things are set up, we just can't keep open an investigation without evidence for past 30 days. We get in trouble. I used to get in trouble all the time. I was at the 40 days, 50 days. My boss, Stolar, you need to close these out, or you need to turn this into a case. I was like, I just need a little more time. And it was really hard, because especially if your gut was telling you that something was going on and you had this pressure to get in, get out. And so I would, say to him, like, I can't get out of this yet. I'm not ready yet. I have to stay a little bit longer. I just need to know this kid's going to be okay. And so oftentimes it means we're going out of our parameters, but it happens. But it's hard. It's really hard, again, when it's not handed to you on a platter. And not that cases should have to be handed on a platter. Wouldn't it be great if they didn't? But I think the way things are now, it's really, really hard. And people just make assumptions. Either CPS is taking away too many kids, or they're not taking away enough, right? Law enforcement's either arresting too much or not arresting too much. They don't do anything. Like it's like one or the other. Like there's no in between anymore about anything. And that's kind of crazy. When you and I, the work we do, we're like, okay, wait, I want to understand this. I want to understand that. I want this, and I want all the information, before I make a decision. And so it's a hard time, even more so, I think now, for these types of cases. But hopefully kids feel more confident in speaking up and talking to the people that they trust, the adults in their lives. And if it's not their parent, then maybe it's the next door neighbor, or maybe it's the school counselor, and that's as long as they have a person. Yeah
and that could be the toughest part for a lot of kids that are in abusive situations, because a lot of them are experiencing that isolation. They're experiencing that loss of power, that loss of voice, that loss of control. So I do think, hopefully, I'm hopeful that, one day systemically we can improve in terms of ways that we can look more deeply as a system into emotional abuse, because that, I think, that leaves the deepest scars on a lot of folks
that
that have been going through abuse, even if they were never physically touched or, things like that. And I do think that's one of those things. But we're at the end of the hour. And so I want to give you the opportunity to tell folks how they can find you if you're working on anything that we can support you with.
Sure. For therapists, you can find me at therapistcourtprep.com. For parents who've heard some interesting information and want a little bit more about kids and court and trauma reduction, you can go to kc-cc.org. And then for my expert witness cases, you can find me at nicolstolar.com, which is NICOLSTOLAR. And you can find me one way or another, but don't stalk me because that freaks me out. but I'm just grateful for anyone listening who, if you're willing to take a second look and help keep a kid safe, but even just talking to our own kids and our own nieces, nephews, and letting them know that we have their back, and it really doesn't matter who, where, what, when, why, or how, but that we're there for them to keep them safe. And just knowing they have somebody to go to, I think that's really how we start preventing child abuse. Is we have to let kids know. We think kids know it. They don't. We have to give them the permission. We have to give them the permission to disclose, the permission to know that their body is theirs, the permission to know that we are going to listen to them and not be upset no matter what they tell us. That's part of us building that trust and communication. And that's how we keep kids safe, because secrets is how kids get hurt. And so by kind of shifting away from that, that's really what we can do to help keep kids safe. So thank you for having me back. And I just appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you. And if you see something, say something.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I appreciate you coming on and educating our listeners.
Thank you.
All right, so you heard that interview with Nicole Stolar-Peterson. Let me know what you thought about it, and be sure to follow me on social media and let us know if this episode helped you and it educated you and made you think more about things, and maybe how you would approach things in the future if you encountered someone who was in an abusive situation. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and listening to the podcast this week. And until next time, you guys take care of yourself and be well.